Welcome back. All right, starting off today with a history video, and yet there isn't a season for me to put on this board. There isn't a logo for me to put on this board because no games were played. 2004, 2005, and I'm going to explain my getup here. I've got my Jekyll and Hyde jersey because there was certainly some Jekyll and Hyde from both the players and the owners during that period of time. And you can't see me, my John Cena hat, because we didn't see any hockey players playing NHL hockey that year, so I figured that works. At any rate, cost certainty were the two words that echoed throughout the hockey landscape that year. It was stated by Gary Bettman, and what's interesting is the first lockout, Bettman was still kind of the seen as the mouthpiece of the owners and not necessarily seen as Commissioner Bettman. By the time we reach the 03-04 season and then we get into the lockout, absolutely he was seen more as the commissioner, which I still say is what the owners wanted. The owners wanted to hire Gary Bettman so that everybody be mad at him. Don't be mad at the 30 owners who vote in favor of a lockout. Get mad at the guy who's sitting at the microphone and taking the questions, right? So for Bettman, it's salary cap or nothing. And for Bob Goodnow, who was representing the NHLPA, he came out and said, we will not have a salary cap. And that's why Bob Goodnow is no longer the head of the NHLPA. Once we heard this stand, which was the NHL saying, we're losing money, we've got too many teams losing money, we need to have cost certainty, and the NHLPA saying, listen, you guys can mind your own business and do your own books, but we're not going to agree to a salary cap. We knew what was coming. The players have been preparing for roughly 2 years. They'd basically been told, you guys need to make sure you got, enough money to carry over a little bit. Obviously, the union does pay out a bit during a strike, but or in this case, a lockout. But it's not the kind of money that they're used to getting from their contracts, right? Now, average salaries had gone through the roof. 94-95, the average salary in the NHL was $733,000 US. By 03-04, it was $1.8 million per player. And so the NHL looked at these spiraling costs, and rather than look at the owners that signed off on these contracts or the GMs that offered them, they decided the players were the problem. And this is where my disconnect with the league comes in. And I've said this before, if you spend yourself into the poorhouse, that's probably saying something about your lack of restraint on spending. And that was kind of how I saw it, that these GMs would get into bidding wars and, oh, this guy got him for $6 million and this guy $6.5 million. And there wasn't really a checks and balance in place to make sure they could afford these contracts they were signing. But again, is that on the players? Right? But because of the fact that the billionaires controlled more advertising money and they definitely had more of an ability to spin this, the sentiment from the public turned against players pretty quickly. It became players are being greedy. Ticket prices are already going up way too fast, and this is on the players. The players, they're huge, ridiculous, basically demands for contracts are what's putting us here. So there were also planned rule changes that had been shelved until we'd have a CBA agreement. They were even going to mess around and see if no-touch icing would work. So what we have right now is the hybrid icing, where it's not fully no-touch icing, but they were considering it, and various rules to try to encourage scoring in the National Hockey League, because they understood that while the salaries had gone through the roof, scoring had dropped through the floor. So that was something that just didn't work, right? You're paying, ridiculous amounts of money to players, and the game had never been more slow, plodding. Scoring chances, what are those? It had really, really dried up. And so the National Hockey League had two problems. They had the cost certainty issue, and they had an entertainment issue. This was not an entertaining product to watch anymore. So refs weren't calling anything. And I put this up here because one of the articles I was reading from this period of time was that one of the arguments that fans had was refs weren't calling anything in the third period or overtime of playoff games. And that the way that a game's called in December is not the same way that a game's called in the playoffs. So that was a thing that used to happen in the National Hockey League. I'm really glad that doesn't happen anymore. So this argument over, referees should just call it the same from game one till the Stanley Cup final, it's been out there for a very, very long time. This is 20 years ago. We're still having the debate now. I don't think it's ever going to change. Now, one thing that had happened was Dominic Hasek had come out of retirement to sign with the Senators. So Ottawa was seen as a potential favorite going into the 04-05 season, a season that was never meant to be, proving that the hockey gods really don't like Ottawa very much. But Hasek signing in Ottawa was seen as a very hopeful sign of things. Of course, at this point, we're a little over a decade since a Canadian team won a Stanley Cup, but Ottawa was seen as a team that might be able to get it done, that adding Hasek gave them that goaltender they might need. Now, we're not going to have a repeat for Tampa, and I think if we'd had the 04-05 season, there was a much better chance than when we get to 05-06 and everything blows up. And this was a lost season for Detroit. Detroit was seen as a potential contender as well. So in Detroit, definitely some frustration for their fans. The idea that maybe the 05 Cup would have gone there. But frustration all around the league. Now, one thing that helped get people through that lockout was Sidney Crosby was in his draft year. And Crosby was lighting up junior hockey and was seen as like the next one, and he was going to be a phenomenal player. I definitely heard some people say, well, look, until he's played a game in the NHL, he might be a bust. We just don't know. There's way too much hype around this guy. Way too much hype when there's this much hype. Right, yep, Anyways, so Crosby's in the spotlight. We know that he ends up getting drafted by the Penguins. The draft that they had in 2005 had to be weighted to favor teams that had finished towards the bottom of the standings. I think it was averaged over 3 years. And so it was a real true draft lottery where all the picks from 30 through 1 were revealed, and Pittsburgh got number 1, which some people didn't like at the time. There were those that were not a big fan of that at the time. But at any rate, yeah, Crosby's in the spotlight. The Thrashers were seen as a potential playoff team in 2005 too. They put together a pretty good roster, and so we just don't know what we lost with that lockout season. There could have been some great storylines in the 04-05 season that now it's just remembered for the lockout. The lockout began September 16th, 2004, in theory. The reality is that a lot of free agents were out there because on July the 1st, it was crickets. Nobody was signing. Nobody was signing because we knew what was coming. The season got canceled on February 16th of 2005. And I remember the mood being, just end it. Just get it over with. And then there was a rumor afterwards that Mario Lemieux, Wayne Gretzky, and some others had been working behind the scenes on an agreement. And then there was a meeting, and then that meeting didn't bring anything to fruition, and it all fell apart. There was a website created, freestanley.com. So if you've watched the series all the way through, you know that the Stanley Cup started out as a challenge trophy. It was awarded by Lord Stanley, and you could challenge for it. Eventually, the NHL gets the rights to it, and so it's theirs, and nobody can challenge for it anymore, even though the WHA did try. But Free Stanley was with the mind of, hey, if the NHL's not going to award the trophy, that trophy should be given back. There should be holders of the cup, and then we can have a tournament where somebody gets their name on the Stanley Cup in 2005, and if it's not an NHL team, well, then it's not an NHL team. And honestly, as silly as it may sound to some, I thought it had some validity. I didn't think for a minute that the Stanley Cup was going to get awarded to a junior hockey team or to a senior, like, AA hockey team out of Ontario or something like that. But I did think that there was something to the idea that trophy shouldn't be sitting there for a year. So there was some debate about whether or not the NHL might lose control of the trophy if this fight went on for more than a year. But of course it got solved before we look at a second season. ESPN had a 2-year deal with the NHL, basically an extension of their contract. But they had an out after year 1, and guess what? This was year 1. The NHL couldn't have timed the lockout worse. Not for basically broadcasting in the U.S. So right now we've got ESPN Plus, and it's all back on ESPN, but it shouldn't have left ESPN. And the lockout was blamed by many for ESPN just saying, you know what, we're done. Like, hockey in Canada will always have a national audience. It would take a lot and a long time for Rogers or TSN or anybody who has rights to say, we'll relinquish these, we'll opt out. I can't see it. Now, the NHL commissioned a report which claimed that 76% of all revenue for the league was going to the players. And immediately the NHLPA disagreed with that claim and they wanted to see the numbers, which, as I remember, the NHL said, no, it's our report. Go get your own report. And so basically, this was to set up the idea that the NHL is losing money. And plenty of times we had owners and Bettman himself coming out with, "Hey, we wanna keep this product where it's reasonably cheap and inexpensive to go to games for fans. The players are, and I mean, they wouldn't use the word greedy necessarily, but they would insinuate greedy, that the players were greedy, and that they were driving costs out of control for your basic, hockey viewer and fan that might want to go and see a game. And they talked a really good, really good game. And that's part of how they swayed public opinion. But the reality was that you had billionaires on one side, millionaires on the other. Billionaires will be able to outweigh millionaires. Even though the NHL players had been getting ready for this for a couple of years, still, the owners, many of them had other businesses that made money. So losing their NHL team for a year wasn't necessarily a huge deal to them. In fact, for the ones that are losing money at the NHL at this point, they're arguing they make better money by shutting the league down than they would have if they'd played that season. And again, looking at where costs are now, when you look at the salary cap and looking at what the costs were then, I don't know how much truth there is to it. I think there's some truth to it. I think there are some teams that might have been on the verge of going out of business, but I don't know how much truth there is to it. Negotiations stalled from September until December. One of the most frustrating things about this time was that September 16th, the lockout starts, and they just go home. They just go home. And so as fans, the message it sent to me as a fan was something simple. Okay, so we don't agree, so we're just going to go home and stop negotiating. So if you guys care so much about the game and the fans are so important, why aren't you guys locking yourself in a room and hammering this out? Why don't you get a third party mediator to step in and go, okay, you'll get this done and sign. Like I've this is the one thing that's always frustrated me with the National Hockey League, and I think this is why we've had so many labor stoppages. They don't negotiate until there's a gun to their head. They don't negotiate until they're at the very last moment, and it drives me insane. I'd give them a little bit of a with like one of those tiny little hammers, just hit the right part of the brain where it kind of knocks their memory for a bit and go, hey, you got 5 hours to get a CBA done. You got 5 hours. Hey, and do that like 6 months before the CBA's due. They get a CBA done in about 5 hours. It is so frustrating. So they go months with nothing. And so we as fans are left to say, so does the league actually care about the fans as much as they're saying? Because they're not fighting that hard to get the season going. And the players, it was kind of the same thing of, okay, so they're going overseas, they're playing in Europe, they're still making an income. How desperate are people to actually get National Hockey League hockey back? February 14th of 2005, the union offers a $52 million cap, but not tied to revenues. Okay, we'll agree to a salary cap, but not tied to revenues. The league countered with $40 million plus $2.2 million in benefits. The NHLPA rejected it. This is the moment where the NHLPA should have tapped out. The moment that they tabled an offer that had the word salary cap in it, they had lost. It was over. This was done. You have now agreed to a salary cap. That's it. And players were I'm trying to think of a G-rated way to say this. They were very perturbed, not happy. The union just absolutely threatened to implode. The union threatened to implode, and when it came out of, hey, so $52 million cap, then there were a lot of players who rightfully asked, so why have we been sitting out? We were told there will be no acceptance of a salary cap ever, and now you've put an offer out there that includes a salary cap. So the NHL, knowing there's blood in the water, would never move off of that. Like, the numbers change, but they don't have to move off a salary cap now because the players agreed to it. The players are saying it's not tied to revenue, though, and the NHL's going, yeah, it is. And you're going to agree to it. At that moment, Gary Bettman had won. At that moment, Bob Goodnow's job is essentially finished as the NHLPA head. So there were last minute attempts to save the season, as I said, which again was more frustrating for me as a fan than anything. Because word leaks out of, okay, they've got concessions here and here. They haven't agreed on this. They've got a concession here. There just isn't enough time left. Because Gary Bettman had said February 16th or we're done. Why weren't they negotiating in December? Why weren't they negotiating in November? What was wrong with October? Why couldn't they negotiate then? There was nothing they were hammering out on February 14th that they wouldn't have been able to try to hammer out in November. It's just that pressure point has to be there, or else the NHL and the NHLPA don't sit down and talk about it. So, Marty Walsh, don't allow this to happen. This is the biggest mistake from this era. Everybody basically wants to say, it's all Gary Bettman. And it's easy. It's easy to blame the guy in the picture there and say it's all on him. This was all on him. He did it. He did it. No, both sides were definitely at fault here. And both sides definitely sat at home and did not negotiate, which did not sit well with fans. Made it feel like, okay, they can live without us. Cool, good to know. I was honestly kind of surprised at how quickly fans returned to the arena, which didn't work for the fans because there were fans that were threatening to boycott when they did get this done. They were saying, you know what, this has gone on too long. There's too much greed on both sides. What about us? Why don't we have a say in this? Fine. We're not going to go back when they get this negotiated, and they're going to be absolutely stunned by empty arenas. That was the conversation. It didn't happen. So this is why when people talk about, I'm never going to watch the NHL again, I'm done with the NHL, I always kind of chuckle and think, sure, because I've been hearing that for a long time. And in 2004 and 2005, it was pretty deafening from fans. The idea of, hey, you guys negotiate this or else we're not coming back. And neither the union nor the league seem to be bothered by that threat. And now they know that threat is completely and totally empty. So sides began meeting again in June. So from February until June, crickets, which again is just awful. It was like they went, well, season's canceled. All right, bye everybody. All right, we're gonna be like a 6.5 hour meeting because of that whole Gretzky Lemieux thing that people were talking about. But then we're just gonna go home until June. So they don't want to lose another season. I wish they hadn't wanted to lose the one season, but they did. And a deal is ratified July 21st of 2005. Now, the union vote was 87% in favor. Overwhelmingly in favor, but it means 13% of the players were still saying, screw the cap. And there were players who did not come back to the National Hockey League after that. Not in the kind of numbers that I think we remember. Like, there's a lot of people that sort of think, oh, it ended some of these great careers. Some of them, yes, but I think that's just sort of how, time works, and guys were getting older anyways. So, after ratifying this deal, it's 5 days before Bob Goodenow is gone. And Bob Goodenow was a dead man walking as soon as that union offer $52 million cap came up. And it always felt like there was infighting, and I don't think Goodenow wanted the cap. I always got the feeling that Goodenow was strong-armed out, and they were like, look, just, give them this cap, this number here. Ted Saskin would take over. Saskin wasn't in charge of the union that long, as I remember, but I haven't done like NHLPA head videos other than on Eagleson. But I could, and I absolutely probably should. So during the lockout, I also wanted to mention, coming out of this too, Bill Daly gets promoted to the role he currently occupies. Bill Daly was excellent for the NHL. His ability to send a message and talk to the press, and his ability to keep his cool and his calm, absolutely, Bettman looked at him and said, that's the guy. During the lockout, 78 players played in Russia, 75 played in Sweden, 51 played in the Czech Republic, and 43 played in Switzerland. I believe it was 45 played in Finland as well. I don't have the Finland on the board there, but I think it was 45. Now, that sounds like it must have been great for those leagues, and it was. But what this also causes is a knock-on effect. So if there's some players playing in the AHL who would have been in the NHL, there are players playing in foreign leagues that wouldn't have been playing there. So for guys who are making, a couple of grand a month to play in these leagues, well, now they're out of work because the NHLers have come over and taken their jobs. So something that there was some talk about it at the time was that these guys have got themselves locked out of their league, and then they go overseas and they make money pushing guys out of their jobs. It just didn't sit well, I think, with some players. And honestly, for some fans, myself included, it kind of felt like, well, wait a minute. And then there were attempts to start rival leagues as well. There were WHA rumors that had started in 2002, and it just never quite worked. I think Bobby Hall was behind it. It just never quite happened. There was another rival league that was attempted, but that never came to fruition either. You had the NHL All Stars tour. I believe it was Gretzky's All Stars that was out there too. Or was that was in '95? But I know there was like a star tour of various NHL All Star players, and you could go out and watch them play their exhibition game. I think they had like a 4-on-4 setup or whatever it was. But the attempts to start rival leagues all fell apart, of course. And so for hockey players who were trying to keep themselves in shape and get some hockey in, they were doing whatever they could to get that. But it was definitely in some cases at the expense of career minor leaguers who were out of a job now because of them. So it was not just the National Hockey League affected, it was other leagues around the world. Any professional hockey league might have had NHLers in it that year because they didn't have an NHL to play in. So they end up giving the players a year in the AHL, though. And I think one thing is that while you had some veterans that were playing that shouldn't have been, it also prevented some players who were young and maybe not ready for the NHL to come up to play in the AHL and then come up to the NHL after the lockout settled. Jason Spezza was the example that everybody used, where he probably would have been up with the Ottawa Senators that year. Instead, he has to stay down with their AHL team. I think it was the Binghamton Senators at the time. Not sure. But at any rate, Spezza has to play in the AHL, and he played really, really well. He got to dominate at the AHL level, and then the following season in the NHL, he was fantastic. So there's something to be said for players having a chance to play in the AHL. It gave some young guys a chance to develop that way. So the players who didn't return after the lockout, Ron Francis, Igor Larionov, Al McInnes, Mark Messier, Adam Oates, Scott Stevens, amongst those that didn't return. All of those veteran older players, and it made sense they wouldn't have come back in 05-06. Although there were some that felt that the year off gave them a chance to heal up and might have extended their careers. I believe it was Teemu Selanne that credited the lockout with extending his career. But at any rate, it was an ugly scenario, it was an ugly time, and it was frustrating as fans because you would get these times where they would meet and they'd negotiate and then they go home. And I to this day do not understand going home without a deal. And if it's, well, they were too set in their side of the argument, okay, well then take a couple of days or a week. Why does it require months? Why? Just it's so insane to me that they couldn't sit down and negotiate, because when they needed to the following June, they did. And of course, the NHL players took the salary cap. They also screwed over players coming in on entry-level contracts. That's where the entry-level cap came in. And for the veteran players, they were kind of fine with that. They wanted to get back to playing hockey. And for the young players, they'll figure it out. And of course, to this day, the entry-level contract is still very similar to what we had coming out of the lockout in 05-06. But 2004-2005 was the season that should have been. It wasn't. And to this day, it's one of those things that I find it to be a head scratcher. And it's why, as we look ahead to 2026, and there's the possibility that we could be staring down the barrel of a lockout in 2026. I don't think we will, but this is why I worry that we could, because I've seen before they don't negotiate ahead of time. They seem to find whatever reason it is to keep things going for as long as possible in terms of lockouts. And they don't negotiate until they absolutely have to. It's the absolute last minute. And that's very frustrating as a fan to see. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, don't forget to hit like and subscribe in the event you've not done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.